Hi, James Browne here. Um, so I did this talk at the first London Vue.js Meetup the night before last, and I was one of the organisers, as was Jack Barham, and we put a lot of effort into it. But despite all our efforts, managed not to get a decent enough recording of the actual talk. And a few people have asked me to, so I'm going to re-record the talk as a screencast now. So welcome. I'm a web developer, like many other people, and I came to Vue.js through Laravel. So, if you don't know what Laravel is, it's a PHP MVC framework, and the creator of Laravel, Taylor Rockwell, has picked up and is championing Vue.js as his JavaScript front-end framework of choice, which piqued the interest of quite a few of us Laravel developers. And a lot of us have come over into the Vue.js community. I'm one James Browne on Twitter, and that's my website address there. So I'm not the creator of Vue or Redux or Vuex, which is I'm talking about today. Who are the experts? So Evan Yu, which if you're watching a Vue.js themed screencast, then you probably know who he is already. He's the creator of Vue.js. He's a pretty smart guy. He's extremely hardworking. He he became a dad for the first time, it seems, a couple of weeks ago, and yet he still has time to commit to the Vue.js and Vuex repos on a daily basis, it seems. Dan Abramoff is a very talented young developer. He is the creator of the Redux library, which is insanely popular right now. He recently moved to London, I think, and I think he now works for Facebook. Now, both these people are eminently Googleable, and I would recommend that you go and follow them on Twitter and read and listen to what they have to say about the things that they're doing, because they're both very, very interesting. So what I'm talking about here is what problem are we trying to solve by including Vuex or Redux or a FLUX library or whatever into our project? You know, we are including an extra library, and it's not just the extra code. There's architectural changes that will be felt throughout our application, and we need to be solving a problem if we're going to be making those sorts of changes to our entire application. Otherwise, there's no point doing it. So, as a corollary to that, when is it not appropriate to solve this problem? What makes Redux so good, and why is it so popular? Because it is super awesome. How is it possible? Should we use Redux with Vue.js? Why that might be a bad idea. Although I'm not going to advocate against it, I'll explain why that might be a bad idea, and then I'll talk about Vuex and do a short example of that. So, our problem. So, yeah, there's an ugly truth that we as JavaScript developers, web developers, most of us, I know, especially if you've been around the business for a number of years, as I have, responsible for the maintenance of and have also been responsible for the creation of great big balls of ugly monster spaghetti JavaScript, which you wouldn't deny is complex. So we reach for JavaScript libraries and frameworks to solve this problem, to reduce the complexity towards simplicity a bit. We componentize our front end. We think about each of our components as a black box with simple inputs and outputs, so we can reason about them more easily. But then what happens is we start to put them together to make the interface actually work. We have to accept the user interaction. We have to deal with updates coming over the wire. Components need to react to the user input. They need to display new data. They need to communicate with each other, crucially. And, you know, there's application logic, so sometimes they have to communicate and sometimes they don't, depending on conditions dictated by the application spec. So the requirements are complex, and as projects go on, the requirements get more complex. They never get less complex. So What we're all looking for is the simplest way possible to capture this complexity. But it turns out that even with these libraries and frameworks and this componentized front end, applications are still quite difficult to understand. They're complex. So all of us, I think, are looking for a silver bullet to solve this problem. So yeah, the problem is complexity explodes. So we've componentized our application. But when you look at the intercomponent communication, it's still like a bowl of spaghetti, really. I mean, look at that diagram on the right. This is a diagram taken from a great article about Vuex on a website called skyronic.com, which is unfortunately the older Vuex API now, but still very much worth reading. Now, it's a simple to-do list application with a reset button, a task filter, a task count. And you can see the blue pills are components, Vue components nested. The blue lines denote the component hierarchy. The red lines are points of communication between those components in order to make the application work in the way that the user expects. They could be events. But that's quite complicated, really. And if you think about it, that's about as simple as an application gets. That's 6 components. And what would it look like with 20 components or 40 on multiple pages? The complexity explodes. It's not quite, it's not quite every component has to communicate with every other component, but it's almost like that. It feels like that sometimes. It's a bit like when you take your headphones out of your pocket, except it's 20 sets of headphones, and yeah, it's difficult. So I've stolen this quote from a really great talk by Rich Hickey, the originator of the Clojure language, called Simple Made Easy, which I'd recommend watching. He talks about this simplicity and complexity problem. And at the beginning, he puts up this quote, which is self-evident, really, from Özge Dijkstra. Simplicity is a prerequisite for reliability, which, yeah, it's self-evidently true. If it's simple, we've got fewer bugs and it's easier to maintain. We can do more in less time, and hopefully, hopefully people will pay you more money. So, a quick diversion. It's become traditional. In fact, I think it's obligatory every time you discuss one of these extra libraries to use around, e.g., React or Vue, etc. You have to say, don't use this solution until your problem is complex enough. Because I think people come to Vue or any new JavaScript framework early on, and they can't see the wood for the trees, really, so they try and learn the whole thing at the same time. And then they get confused and maybe angry, I think. I don't know. It's a difficult problem, this, how complex is complex enough. And the truth is, it's complicated. It's up to you to decide, really. I think if you are building a production application and you're responsible for putting it together and deciding the architecture right at the beginning, I think you are the person best qualified to decide, does my application benefit from the addition of this library and the architectural changes and the straitjacket that it puts on you? Is it welcome, this restriction, or is it unwelcome? That's your decision. So, what's the silver bullet? Well, surprise, surprise, there isn't a silver bullet, I don't think. I think we're all trying to solve this problem on some level. All of these front-end frameworks are also trying to solve the same problem, trying to solve this complexity problem, trying to take your complex requirements and make it much simpler to build a user interface. How do we make this complicated thing simple? I mean, is that even possible? Should we be searching for a silver bullet, or should we just get on with building with the tools that we've got? So we're the Vue.js community at the London Vue.js Meetup, and if you're on the web looking at this, yeah, you're probably into Vue.js as well. Can we use a solution from the React community to help solve this problem? Well, both Vue.js and React aim to be just the Vue layer. which means they just deal with the bits that the user sees and interacts with, and they don't attempt to do anything much towards managing the rest of the application. So it stands to reason that patterns and libraries that are designed to fit around that React Vue layer might also be worth a look when we're using Vue.js. So Facebook proposed an architectural pattern some time ago, which I'm sure you've heard of unless you've been hiding under a rock. FLUX. So the big thing about FLUX is it has unidirectional data flow. Wow. It's the data flows from the action, which is the thing that's happened, through this dispatcher, which dispatches it to the store, and the store is the repository for all of the application state. And when the application state updates, it tells the Vue, oh, the state is updated. Why don't you change what the user can see so that it reflects what the state of the application is? It's a one-way flow, which you can imagine that's easier to think about than the diagram that we saw a few slides back, where components can communicate with each other up and down that component hierarchy, and also backwards and forwards, really, if you think about your logically as your architecture with one black box following another. So it's unidirectional flow, although of course views can dispatch actions, so it's one way and also circular, but still easier to think about because there aren't arrows pointing everywhere in this diagram. So there are many Flux libraries, and there's been this great flowering of these libraries, and all of these developers who've come up with them are trying to search for the one true way to implement Flux to make their applications the simplest that they possibly can. Now, it turns out that it's quite complicated, what's this dispatcher doing? And there are multiple stores, and it's difficult. And there hadn't really been a library that everyone had settled on, agreed with is the best thing, until recently. It seems like I'm not big in the React community, but it seems like, from looking in from the outside, that Redux has become really popular, insanely popular. Everyone's talking about it. So Redux was released in June 2015, so it's pretty new, or ancient in the JavaScript library terms. A bit of amazing trivia is that Dan Abramov put a Redux together as a byproduct of work he did on a talk at ReactConf EU 2015. So he applied to be a speaker. So he just they sent a title and some text. It was about developer tools, time travel, and hot reloading, which I'll talk about a bit later on, I think. And then in the close run up to the talk, he implemented his own Flux implementation, Redux, just as a way to make his life easier giving the talk. And it turns out that this is the library that many people in the React community have settled upon for their state management needs. So yeah, Redux isn't really Flux, sorta, or well, it is and it isn't. It uses functional composition rather than registering callbacks, which sounds more complicated, but actually turns out to be simpler to think about in the long run. The flow is still unidirectional, and you still have actions and a store, although there's only one store. So, 3 principles of Redux. The state is stored in a single object, as opposed to vanilla Flux, where there are multiple stores, each with their own representation of state. In Redux, the state is stored in a single object. The state's read-only, it's immutable. The only way to change the state is to dispatch an action. And an action is just a plain object with a type, a name, which describes what the action is. By convention, this is all uppercase with words separated by underscores. And there can be an optional payload as well. So here we've got an add to do with some text, finish slides, which I did a while ago now. the state can only be changed by pure function. So a pure function is one that doesn't do I/O, doesn't change global state, doesn't mutate its parameters. These functions are called reducers, and the general signature is it takes the application state and the action, and then it returns the new state. So it takes the old state, does some work, and then it returns a new state object. So yeah, the Vue layer is most predictable when it's described as a pure function of the application state. This is something that Dan Abramov says in his series of videos on Redux, an intro to Redux on, I believe it's the egghead.io website. It's a really interesting thing to go through. I think it's only about an hour or so of videos, and he steps through and he implements a simple version without any edge cases, that sort of thing, of Redux in front of you, just so you can understand what's going on. It's really worth looking at. He says the Vue layer is most predictable when it's described as a pure function of the application state. So this is what React brings to the table, or similar. If you can make your React Vue layer, and you can think about it in such a way as that it's just a function, that you present the state to this Vue layer, and then it renders something to the user. So it doesn't have any side effects apart from what the user sees. So it's a function where you give it the state and then it shows the user something. And if you want to change what the user sees, you change the state and rerun this Vue layer function. So that makes it quite easy to think about. You change the state and then the view updates. What Redux, I think, tries to do is make the state changes, this side of the application, similarly easy to think about. So you have your reducer functions, and yes, there are multiple reducer functions, but they're composed together, and at the top level you have a single reducer function with this signature. It takes the old state and the action that's happened, and then it returns the new state. So you take the old state, run the reducer, returns the new state. You pass that new state to the Vue function, and then it renders to the user. So the state changes, and then the view changes. It's easy to think about. Yeah, so I'm not going to go too much further into Redux because I want to move on to Vuex. There's a lot more to know about Redux. I've talked briefly about reducer composition, which is how you modularize the logic in your application. Remember, reducers are where the state gets changed. And there's action creators, which are functions that return these action objects. And action creators is where the async happens, and where data fetching, that sort of thing, happens. And there's also some complexity about how do you wire up your view with this state change. So in Redux, you subscribe to the store. So the store contains the state, and you subscribe to store changes. And when the state changes, your subscribed components, anyone who's interested, gets updated with the new state. So if the state's changed, what do you want to do about it, basically? There's some complexity about how you wire up your components, but I'm not going to go into that now. So what makes Redux awesome? Why would you use it? So Dan Abramov's big thing was developer tools. He was talking about developer tools. Hot reloading, which is not his innovation. It's something that, for example, Webpack enables. It allows you to, when you're looking at your single page application that you're developing, you might be clicking around it and developing a sequence of events, and you get to a certain state in your application. Now imagine that you encounter a bug. Well, what you can do is you can go into your code, change one of those modules where you think the bug occurred, and then the hot reloading system will replace that code live in the browser without reloading the page or losing your state, losing your place. Basically, it's not the same as like a live reload server. It's actually replacing the code in the running browser, in the running page. It's really interesting. And it adds this idea of time travel. So if you can think really simply about each action being dispatched through these reducers, and then it changes the state one action at a time. They can only happen one at a time. If you keep a copy of the original state plus which action was dispatched each time, then you can quite easily step backwards and forwards in time in your application, given some tools to do so. All you need to do is replay the actions from the original state up to that point and run it through the Vue layer. Because there are no side effects going on, we know that just replaying those actions will get you to the same place. So combination of hot reloading and time travel means that you get to a state in your application, you come to a bug, you step backwards using your developer tools time travel tool, which I'll show a bit later on with regard to Vue and Vuex. You change your code where the problem was. It's hot reloaded into the running browser, and when you replay the action where previously there was a bug, hopefully the bug has now gone away without you having lost your place. So it's faster iteration, much easier than having to refresh the page and click around if you can remember what you clicked last time to reproduce your bug. Much easier than that. So it's really interesting. And the other awesome thing that Redux gets you, as opposed to you using Vue, is all of those Redux developers and all of that help for them. It's insanely popular, much more popular than the Vue is at the moment. Although, of course, I'm betting that Vue is going to be a big thing in next year and in the year ahead. So, is it possible? Should we use Redux with Vue.js? Is it possible? Yeah, of course, it can totally be done. Vue is just a Vue layer, Redux just changes the state. There are even libraries, for example, this library Review, with some bindings between Redux and Vue.js. So you somehow subscribe your Vue application or your Vue components to updates and then replace the state of your Vue components so that they update. However, should we do it? Is it the best fit? Well, yeah, maybe it's not. And here's why. I think, I'm not the expert, but React and Vue are optimized differently for processing updates to the DOM. So React, given a new state, renders a virtual DOM, and then it calculates a difference between this new virtual DOM and the old one, which is these virtual DOM objects are just JavaScript objects. So that's actually a pretty quick operation, working out what is different between this new virtual DOM and the old one. And then it very cleverly calculates the most optimal DOM operations in order to make the currently rendered actual DOM on the page match the new virtual DOM. So it only does the most efficient thing that it can calculate. However, given the new state object, it's got no intrinsic knowledge of, given this new state object, which components have updated. It has to re-render the whole page. It makes it look like it re-renders the whole page, but of course, because it's diffing, it's only re-rendering the actual bits that have changed. Vue works differently. It has a reactivity, a dependency management system. So when the Vue instance boots up, it looks at your data, and then it goes through and it uses an ES5 property called object.define properties to set getters and setters on all of your bits of data. And when it renders each component or each directive, I think it sets up, it works out which bits of that data are touched, going through those getters, which bits of those data are touched to render a particular piece of code, and then it records that. And then in the future, when that data is mutated, it records that the data was mutated via the setters, so it knows what's happened when the data changes automatically. And because the dependencies have already been tracked, then Vue automatically knows which bits of data have changed, which bits of DOM depend on those bits of data, and therefore which changes to make to the live DOM. This is what's called the reactivity system, and I'm sure if you're using Vue at all, you've read that brilliant document on the Vue documentation site that explains the process of what's going on there. And that's Vue's killer feature, really. It has a slightly slower setup at the beginning because it needs to set up all of these getters and setters on your data, but it's more efficient. It tries to be more efficient later on because it knows automatically when the data changes which bits of the DOM need to update. So that's to say, Redux doesn't take advantage of Vue's reactivity system. It prefers to completely replace the state object on every update, which is not the end of the world, but it could become a performance problem. Which is where Vuex comes in. As I gave this talk the night before last, 0.4, 0.4.1, and I think, who knows, even as I was speaking, 0.42 of Vuex was released, and I think now, 2 days later, we're on 0.5.2. Yeah, it's under development. So take from that what you will. Originated by Evan-You, the creator of Vue.js, and it's Evan-Yu's answer to Redux. What are the basic concepts here? They're slightly different to Redux. State, we've still got a single state tree, the same as Redux. This state can be split into modules. So the state tree is a single state tree. It's a simple JavaScript object. We have mutations now. Now mutations are functions. They're the only place that you're allowed to change the state. You can't change the state. You're not allowed to change the state, or you shouldn't. Of course, it's JavaScript, so you can change whatever you want, wherever you want. But by convention, the only way to change the state is to change it in a mutation function. The mutation has a name, which is just a function name. And by convention, like the action name in Redux, it's all uppercase with underscores. They have a name, and there's also a handler, and the handler is just the function body. And the function body is where the changes happen. Mutations must be synchronous. You can't go out to external APIs, etc., and be waiting on things. Mutations receive the state as their first argument, although there are optional other arguments should the mutation require a payload. Think about add to do. You're going to need some information about what that to do is. Mutations can also be split into modules, and there's some syntax sugar in Vuex, allowing you to split your mutations and the slices of state to which they correspond into their own separate bits in more complicated applications, which I'm not going to show today because we've only got a very simple example. We've got actions. Now, actions are also functions, and their raison d'etre is to dispatch mutations. Actions can dispatch multiple mutations, and they can be asynchronous. This is where your asynchronous work should happen. They receive the store instance as their first argument, and optional other arguments as payload. The store instance, the Vuex store, contains, amongst other things, this state object that we're talking about, plus a dispatch method. And it's the dispatch method, store.dispatch, which the actions must use to dispatch mutations to mutate the state. Yeah, it's a unidirectional flow, like FLUX and Redux. So we have an action which takes the store. It uses a dispatch method to dispatch a mutation. And the mutation takes the state as the first argument, and it's a function that mutates the state. Now, when the state updates, Vue's reactivity system does the hard work of updating the Vue layer to reflect this new state. So you can think of it quite simply as a unidirectional flow like FLUX and Redux. Again, of course, we've got a circular motion of data here. The Vue components can call actions in response to, e.g., user input. One thing that's important to say is that the Vue components shouldn't mutate the state themselves. As I said earlier, mutation should only happen in those mutation functions, because even though you can change the state, it's JavaScript, of course, you can change the state wherever you've got a reference to that object. If you do that, you're breaking down this nice diagram here of a unidirectional flow, and you lose all of those benefits of being able to think simply about your application. Here you can see actions are where the async work happens. So yeah, you can connect to remote APIs in your actions. For example, you might be fetching data from a remote API. You might, in your action method, dispatch a fetching mutation to say, oh, I've started to fetch, and then you go off with your I don't know, fetch API, and that returns a promise, and in success of the promise you might dispatch a mutation saying new data with a payload with the new data in it, and if the promise fails, you might dispatch a fetch failed mutation, so the user is updated at every step. So this is where the async action happens. So yeah, advantages. It's the same single state tree, the same one-way flow of data as Redux. So you get those advantages. It's easy to think about. But it's also designed to take advantage of Vue's reactivity system, which might have some performance benefits. Yes, so we're mutating the state in the mutator functions instead of making it mutable and replacing it wholesale, as in Redux. So this is the reactivity system that I explained earlier. It's not 1.0 yet, so the API is subject to change, yeah. So before 0.4, before Wednesday, it was a Wednesday morning this week, the docs said API is subject to change. Now the docs say the API is fairly stable, and Evan Yu said on Twitter that when it gets to 1.0, which I'm imagining is not going to be too far off, he said that there may be some small breaking changes, but yeah, you can use it. It's not going to change massively, and really desperately inconvenience you. Again, we don't have many users compared to Redux yet. It's not production, not necessarily, not 1.0 yet, production ready, not really. So there's less help out there, fewer tutorials for you, etc., etc. If you're looking for that sort of thing. And you do lose a bit of convenience compared to vanilla Vue. I mean, one of the things about Vue is that it's got a slightly higher API surface than, for example, React. So it's a Vue layer, but there is a little bit of sugar for you. For example, vModel, which is sugar for a couple of things, and it simulates a two-way binding between, for example, an input and state on that particular element. So you can't bind a vModel onto application state, because that would mean you were mutating the application state in your component, which is not allowed if you're using Vuex. You can do it, but then it breaks your model completely. One thing about Vuex is that there is a Vuex.strict configuration option that you can use in development that will throw, I think, or at least give you an error message when you try to mutate the state outside of mutator function to give you a bit of help, but you have to turn that off in production. So yeah, a quick Vuex example. Counters. Counters. Simple. So it displays counters. Counters, it's just a number with a button saying increase or decrease. I've also got a button saying increment the counter if the counter is currently odd. Increment if odd. Now that's just to show an action that can examine the state to decide whether it goes forward or not, as an example. I'll show you that in a second. Counters can be added or removed. Actually, I've not implemented removing counters, just adding them. But it'll suffice to show you how to get Vuex into your simple application. There's now a VUE-CLI tool, which is amazing. So if you've got a new project, you can use that and get up and running within minutes with hot reloading, time travel set up, and it just works. And if you've ever tried to set it up yourself, you know it's It's not so easy. There's a lot to learn, especially with Webpack configuration. So using the CLI tool might be an idea, even if only to reverse engineer it out into your own project. npm install MyVue CLI, so it's available anywhere in your system. You may or may not want to have it available everywhere. We are using the new Vue CLI tool to init a new project called Vuex example, which will create a directory in your current folder called Vuex example, and it will base it on this Webpack simple template. We cd into this directory, npm install, and then we'll also install Vuex. This is pretty much what it looks like. There's also node modules, of course. It's basically a hello world. It's the output of the this template. We've got a source directory with an app.VUE component. So we have a Vue component, and everything's set up for you to start working with component files via Webpack and Babel. Main.js is the entry point of the application. Index.html, again, it's where you go in your browser. And the rest you should know what that is. Okay, so we've added some files. Actions and store are to do with Vuex. So one of the things that's happened in the shift from 0.3 to 0.4 is that actions have been split out from being bound directly into the store instance. I think people felt that your application structure will be better if your actions weren't explicitly bound into your store. We've added a COUNTER.VUE component as well as the app.VUE component. So basically we're going to render multiple counters as children of the root app component. Main.js is the same, index.html is the same, and I've added a few files. I haven't deleted them, I'm just not showing them here. Index.html, the only thing I've changed here is the title. We've got the body element where the root Vue instance will be bound, and then our custom app.vue component here, this app component, is where everything's going to render. Main.js looks like this. This is the entire thing. I'm using ES6 syntax here. I'll try to explain things as we go along. These are the import statements, replacing require statements, etc. So we're just importing Vue itself from Vue, still via npm. We're importing app, which is our custom Vue component from app.vue in the same directory. And we're also importing our store, which is where we're setting up our Vuex store instance. We're importing that store so that when we new up our root Vue instance here, we can, in addition to the standard setup, bind in store directly. As you can see in the configuration option there for the new Vue instance, we've got a store key. Now that's ES6 object literal shorthand for store:store. So it's just binding in a property with the same name as a variable in the current scope. And it's bound to the body element, as I described before. And there you go, we're passing in the app component as a child component so that it can be properly initialized. STORE.JS I split over 2 slides. It's still short, but here you go. We're importing Vuex from Vuex, importing Vue from Vue. Now, Vuex is a Vue plugin, so we have to tell Vue to use that plugin. Here's the meat and potatoes, as you might say, of putting a new Vuex store together. So when you create a new Vuex store, you create it with the initial state and then the mutations. Now, if you look at that list of mutations, they are those names, those uppercase names. You can see every single type of change that can be made to the application state. So the idea is in Redux applications as well as these Vuex applications is that you should be able to, in an even more complicated application, look through all of the names of the mutations and get a really good idea of what are the things that can happen to this application? So you already know what kind of application it is before you dig into the precise details of what's actually going on. In fact, in more complicated applications, FLUX is advocating taking these mutation names out and defining them as constants in a mutation types file, so that you can easily scan that, and then defining them here with the constant as the function name, which you can do in ES6. So yes, initial state. We've got one key. It's counters. It's an array. I'm representing each of these counters as an integer, representing what number the counter is currently on. Obviously, simple example. That's a bad idea in practice. Yada yada. But this is what we've got for the moment, just as an example. Mutations. We've got our three mutations here: increment, decrement, add counter. That's fairly self-explanatory. We're using this ES6 big arrow function syntax. It's got slightly different behavior to normal functions, but here that's irrelevant. It takes the state as the first argument, and then any other optional arguments. So add counter doesn't take any other optional arguments, but increment and decrement, they both need to know which counter in the list of counters you're incrementing and decrementing. So yes, it needs a counter ID, which we will have to manually pass in. One thing to note, so the whole point of using Vuex is that we can take advantage of Vue's reactivity system. So you have to follow the Vue reactivity rules as set out in the Vue documentation. So here we've got an array, counters, state.counters, an array, and in order to mutate an object in that, an element of that array, we should use this convenience $set method. So $set the element at index counter ID, and then change the state of that counter by adding 1 to it. That's fairly self-explanatory. We can also use the simple array methods, for example, push or shift, which Vue has shimmed in order to detect when changes have been made. ACTIONS.JS. This is the whole file. So in the current Vue documentation, Vuex documentation, it recommends having them in a separate file and exporting each action as a constant. So the action takes the store as its first, as opposed to the state. It takes the entire store, which is the object that contains, amongst other things, the state, and as dispatch method. It takes the store as a first argument, and of course any other payload that's required, e.g. the counter ID here, so we know which counter to increment and decrement. So the first two functions are really simple. We are using ES6 object destructuring to select out the dispatch method from store. So it's effectively store.dispatch increment. But here we can just write dispatch increment because we've selected that out. So dispatch increment and pass the counter ID. That's easy enough. And same with add counter. Now, increment if odd, I've shown that you can just take the store in, and then if you want to, for example, only dispatch something if the state is meets a particular condition. Here I'm saying if the particular counter is odd, then dispatch this increment mutation, and if it's even, don't do that. Now, this is in these actions. This is where your async work, this fetching, sending off multiple dispatches, would happen. Here's our counter template. So I've split the Vue templates, the Vue components up into a couple of slides. So on template, we've got the current count and some buttons, which on click will decrement, increment, and increment if odd. Now, current count will be wired up directly to the application state, and decrement increment call directly the actions that we've defined, and I'll show you how that happens right now in the script tag. So we are importing increment, decrement, and increment if odd actions from our actions.js file, and we are binding them into our Vue component by way of this extra bit of configuration, these extra configuration keys that Vuex provides. For example, vuex.actions is where you bind your actions in. Again, I'm using the ESX object literal shorthand for properties. So the increment is equivalent to increment : increment. And so I'm binding those actions straight into the Vue component. And then also there's vuex.state, which allows you to define getters on the current application state. So state.currentCount is a function that takes the state as its first argument and then returns something of the current state. Now this is just a thin layer, I understand, over the Vue component computed property feature, which means that anything in state here that you reference will be caught by Vue's reactivity, Vue's dependency tracking system, so that when you update it, anything that relies on this current count getter will be updated, and also that you get for free with this caching or memoizing, so that if you want to do, which you can do, an expensive operation in this, for example, current count function, say you are adding up a really long list of numbers, you can be sure that the result won't change, and it won't be recalculated every time there's a state change. It will only be recalculated when one of those dependencies has changed. So that's a bit more efficient. So at Vue, this is our root Vue component. You can see that I've got a title, then I've got this custom element counter, which will be rendering our counter components that we've just looked at. It's a v4 counter in counters. Now counters is another vuex.state getter, which I'll show you in a second. I'm binding the counter.vue prop counter ID to the index of the counters array here, just for convenience, so that so each counter knows which member in the array it should be looking at. We're putting track by $index in here, because if we don't do that, then when the array changes, the list of counters won't update necessarily. And there's also a button with click bound to add counter. Again, this binds straight into our add counter action in our Vuex application. So let's have a look at the script tag. You import counter from counter.vue and add counter from the actions file. And again, the component is pretty vanilla. You've got your counter component bound in there in the components option key in the Vue component options object. But you've also got your vuex.state and vuex.actions configuration keys. .state, as I've described, is another getter. It takes the state as its first argument and just returns state.counters, which is the array that we're using v4 to loop over. And vuex.actions, we're just binding in that add counter action that's called when the add counter button is clicked. Okay, so now we're going to demo this counters application. npm run dev. This is set up by this VUE-CLI scaffolding tool. Just runs the Webpack dev server. Everything's set up for you. Let's go to localhost 8080. Here we go. So let me just refresh to check it's fresh. Here we go. We've got my counters application. We've got the add counter button. I've not put any effort into design for this. You can see, so I can add a counter, great. I can decrement the counter, I can increment the counter. When the counter is odd, it will increment. When it's even, it won't. I can have as many counters as I like, and they're all independent. As you've seen, it's all wired up. So clicking decrement calls the action defined, bound into this Vue component in vuex.actions. That binding automatically binds in the store, so we don't have to call decrement with the store parameter. We just have to add any payload if we need to. And the payload here is which counter ID it is. It's the first one, so it's going to be counter ID 0. So the action is called with the store and the counter ID. It calls store.dispatch decrement, sending the counter ID as a payload. The mutation receives the state plus the counter ID, and then it mutates the state to decrement the state of the first element in that counter's array by 1. Simple as. Okay, so superpowers. I promised superpowers. So we didn't see this the other night at my talk because it was released into DevTools on the same evening. So let's refresh the page. Detect that we've got Vuex here. So there's this Vuex tab. Let's click on that. Our base state, here it is. This is what we set up in our store.js file. Add a counter, add a counter, add a counter. You can now see our state counters array is 0, 1, 2, 3 elements long, and each of them is 0. Look, here we go. So if I decrement the first counter, look, now it says -1. Increment the second counter, that's now 1. Increment if odd, here you go, it's now 2. Increment if odd again, it's not odd, so it doesn't increment. So you can see the state here, and you can see in order each mutation that was dispatched. So because we've put this effort in to only mutate the state in these mutation functions, which are represented here, I can be sure that when I click on one of these actions, I know that I'm in the state that would happen if all of the mutations with the same payload had been dispatched on top of this base state. I can go backwards and forwards in time. It's sort of like superpowers, really. It's amazing. I love it. And you can revert, reset, that sort of thing, which is great. Okay, yeah, thank you for getting this far. And here's a few resources. I'll post the slides up here. Bit of a reading list, just the Vuex docs. That basics post that I mentioned earlier, it is an old API, but it's still worth reading. I'd very much recommend looking at the Redux video series by Dan Abramov on egghead.io. It's free, I think. If you want to see the example code, you have to pay, but I'd very much recommend looking at it. It's very good. He explains it very well and implements it in front of your very eyes, so that you can better understand what's going on. Here's the link to the sample code from this talk. Although, yeah, as it says there, I would look at the sample code in the Vuex docs. Evan-You is really good at keeping things updated to reflect the current state of the API. So that is much more likely to be up to date. So yeah, thanks. That's me on Twitter. Follow me if you want to, and that's my email address if you want to get in touch with me.